to come in. Great. All right, with that, hello and welcome everyone to Chilling Effects, Cooling Solutions for Building Decarbonization. I'm Kayla Rakes and I'm the engagement coordinator for the Buildings Initiative at WRI. The Zero Carbon Building Accelerator is hosting this webinar today because cooling is a key solution to achieve building decarbonization and achieve our climate goals. I'm joined today by Lily Riahi from Cool Coalition, supported by UNEP, also by Andrea Voigt, by from Danfoss Climate Solutions for Cooling, and Prima Mada from National Resource Defense Fund, Kenzia Petrychenkov, excuse me, from International Energy Agency, and Demetrios Karmitios from Basel Agency for Energy Solutions. So thank you everyone for joining. And first off, we're going to start off with Lily, who's going to be framing the conversation for us today. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me well?
Great, thank you, Lily.
Great. Well, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Lily Riahi, as Kayla just mentioned, and I coordinate the Cool Coalition, a UNEP-led network of over 120 governments, cities, civil society organizations, industry, finance, who have joined forces to advocate, exchange knowledge, and jointly act to accelerate the transition to sustainable cooling. So today's topic is a very hot topic, if I can say that. We have really entered into a new world, I can say. We live on a planet that is already hotter than any world that any human has ever known. Dare I say, extreme heat is not really extreme. As we see, it's becoming a commonplace on the front pages of newspapers all around the world for weeks at a time. In places I never thought would see extreme heat. And it's having catastrophic impact on health. We see that these rising temperatures and extreme heat is really linked to more deaths than any other climate-driven hazard combined. We had almost 400,000 deaths from extreme heat in 2019 alone. And this is also having a huge impact on our economies. So by 2030, this extreme heat will wipe out $2.4 trillion from the world's economy. And we know that it has impacts on our productivity. Extreme heat is also growing. One of the biggest climate justice issues that we face today, exposing and deepening the growing inequality we see based on whether you have access to cooling or not. And we see that this rising heat is especially catastrophic in cities, which are heating up as twice as fast as the average. Today, 1.7 billion people live in urban areas that are exposed to extreme levels of heat, and this will rise dramatically as the planet gets hotter and more people move to urban areas. So the need to act to really ensure that people have access to cooling is crystal clear, but our response so far has been largely inadequate. Today, not only do 1 billion people lack access to cooling, another 2.3 billion lack access to sustainable cooling solutions and are on the verge of purchasing, poor quality or inefficient air conditioners to meet their needs. And air conditioners are really a double burden when it comes to climate change. They use HFCs, which are an extremely potent greenhouse gas and a significant amount of energy. If I give you just one statistic, energy demand is set to triple over the next decades. And by 2050, the amount of energy consumed by cooling, space cooling in particular, space cooling alone would be the equivalent of the electricity consumption of China and India combined today. So that's quite significant in undercutting our goals on the energy transition and achieving net zero buildings. Greening this capacity is not a solution on its own either, because if you look at, for example, I think 2018 was one of the strongest years for solar capacity additions. And the amount of solar capacity that was added to the grid that year was completely outstripped by the demand for residential air conditioners. And that's been a trend we've seen since. So we cannot adapt to rising heat and meet our cooling needs on a business as usual basis. We really need a transition to efficient climate-friendly cooling, and really we need to promote a diversity of solutions to achieve that transition. We certainly need to also rethink our buildings if we want to limit the massive growth in energy for cooling. Space cooling already accounts for 20% of electricity in buildings globally, and it is the fastest growing end use of energy in buildings. So what do we need to do to deliver on net zero cooling for buildings? I think it's really a multi-layered effort. We need to reduce demand for mechanical cooling through better building design, better materials, passive features, increased use of nature in and around buildings. We need to improve efficiency of buildings and mechanical cooling systems by adopting the most efficient technologies. Running an air conditioner in an inefficient building is really like running a faucet in a leaky bucket. So it's critical to improve that efficiency. And of course, the shift to district-based approaches, renewable energy for operations of systems and appliances, and make sure that we shift to low GWP refrigerants. And we know these solutions work. We've seen in cities, for example, in Colombian city of Medellin, urban green corridors have cooled areas by up to 4 degrees. Passive building measures like orientation, insulation, reflection, materials, they can reduce the building's cooling load by up to 25%, even in a hot climate, such as where I'm living in Bangkok. And you can also use materials like colored materials that help reduce heat retention in buildings, biomaterials, and many other techniques that I'm sure we'll hear about from our guests today. So by transforming our concrete jungles into urban forests, we not only make cities and our buildings cooler, but we make them more livable. And crucially, there's a unique opportunity in the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol, which is phasing down HFCs. As I mentioned, climate warming gases used in the cooling industry. By promoting an approach that reduces demand and improves efficiency alongside the HFC phase down, we can double the climate benefits of the Kigali Amendment. And with the right regulatory environment, governments can incentivize the private sector to market sustainable cooling solutions in our cities, buildings, and homes. Now, the task before us is really to bring these solutions to scale at the speed required without further warming the planet. And today, that's what we'll hear about from our esteemed speakers on their views on how we can actually bridge existing gaps and challenges in bringing these solutions to scale and increase access to sustainable cooling without further warming our planet. Thank you so much. I now turn back to Kayla for the presenters. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Lily, for framing that for us. Really appreciate your overview there. And so first up, we're going to hear from Senia for saying your name wrong, Petrichenko, and she's going to be presenting on the sustainable and energy efficient cooling for the Southeast Asia region, international energy agency has recently developed a roadmap, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. So take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kyla, and hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to talk about the roadmap, which I have developed on sustainable and energy efficient space cooling in ASEAN. In my presentation, I will focus mainly on what policies can do to really take us further towards sustainable and energy efficient space cooling. So I will be zooming into Southeast Asia, though I think some of the key points from this presentation are very much relevant to many other regions and countries around the world. So Lily already mentioned the importance of cooling and what kind of situation we're in this heating world. I will just say a few words and give some of IEA data specifically on ASEAN region. As you can see from the chart, the electricity used for cooling in buildings in cold over the past decades, and it's getting to the level of some of the countries around the world. From about 12 terawatt hours in 1990 to 80 terawatt hours in 2020 is almost equivalent to the total annual electricity consumption of the whole country of the Philippines, just to give you the level of the magnitude. At the same time, ownership of air conditioners, which is the primary space cooling appliance, is still relatively low in the region. Across the region, the average ownership is around 18%. It, of course, varies quite significantly between countries. We can see the rate of ownership, while Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam, it's more than 10%. In any case, this suggests that there is a significant potential for growth in air conditioners market and other space cooling appliances, especially as we see, as Lily mentioned, a significant increase in temperatures and heat waves, and people are getting at a higher heat stress and risk to health and productivity, as well as risk to economy. So IEA estimates that the stock of ACs in Asian countries will reach 300 million by 2040, compared to only 50 million today. At the same time, we still estimate that about 40% of population in this region will not have access to clean and reliable space cooling to satisfy their thermal comfort. The good news is that the future is not set in stone, and with energy efficiency measures both on equipment side of cooling, but also in buildings, so more passive measures through improving building envelopes, we can substantially reduce and mitigate the expected growth in electricity demand for cooling and save about 110 terawatt hours of electricity by 2040. This is about current electricity consumption of Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, PDR, and Vietnam combined. On the right-hand side, on the right chart, you can also see that energy efficiency measures can substantially reduce the increase in share of space cooling in peak demand, which is also very important as countries are planning for new power generating infrastructure. With this in mind, I developed two roadmaps this year, one on energy efficient space cooling, and the other one is on buildings and construction in ASEAN region. And these two roadmaps were prepared in collaboration with ASEAN Center for Energy and ASEAN Secretariat, and should really be looked at in conjunction, because they are very complementary, and we shouldn't be looking at space cooling in isolation, but really with synergies with the build environment, also with urban planning, as Lily also mentioned. So we looked at the status on key policy cooling across the region, and as you can see, many ASEAN countries have already implemented mandatory minimum energy performance standards and labeling, or in the process of developing them for key appliances. Air conditioners among of them, fans, which is also one of the key space cooling appliances in the region, is much less prioritized, unfortunately, in terms of policies and regulation. So there is definitely a gap in that regard. But regulations are not the only solution. We really at IEA advocating for policy package approach. This is just example on policy package for appliances from our recent policy toolkit, which we launched at the annual Global Conference on Energy Efficiency in June, which clearly shows that in order to address energy efficiency barriers in any sectors, and we have this kind of packages for other sectors as well, we really need to have a combination of measures between regulation, information instruments, and incentives in order to drive energy efficiency improvements forward in order to achieve our long-term goals and move closer towards net zero. The roadmap, which I'm talking about for ASEAN, also follows this policy package approach and looks at 12 types of policy measures, which fall under these three categories. So this is just a quick snapshot of the key policy measures in which we looked at in the roadmap. Of course, the minimum energy performance standards are the at the heart of the policy package, together with other supporting measures and the need for harmonization of test standards. And there is a lot of work going on in Southeast Asia on that, but also monitoring and verification and enforcement mechanisms to make sure that regulations are working effectively and enforced and compliant with. But very important also that regulations should be supported by information instruments such as labeling. Our analysis shows that combination of standards and labeling has been proven across the world, and many countries have a long track record of these policies to be among the most effective, and at the global level, it allowed to almost halve electricity consumption in the countries which have a long history of implementation of standards and labeling for appliances. And incentives, especially when they are tied together with labeling and performance of appliances, can be really important in order to drive the performance of appliances beyond minimum energy efficiency requirements and reach high levels of energy performance for appliances and cooling equipment. So in the roadmap, and unfortunately I can go into details, you can see much more details on each of the policy instruments, but also have a look at the strategy towards net zero carbon with milestones for 2025, 2030, and current status across the key policy instruments in ASEAN regions. Very important aspect of the policy package for space cooling is what we call ladder approach to set up future efficiency requirements for air conditioning and fans. So here you can just see you just see the illustration of this ladder approach, which basically means that the requirements for energy efficiency of equipment should be regular and substantially increased in order to increase the ambition and remove the least efficient and most energy consuming appliances from the market. On the very left, for 2021, you can see the example for Vietnam. You can see that the minimum energy performance standard level in terms of the efficiency is set quite low in comparison to what we see at the market. In those blue circles, these are kind of the spread of appliances currently on the market. So you can see that most of appliances actually are complying with the minimum energy performance standards, limiting its ability to really push the market towards high levels of efficiency. And also a lot of appliances are in the 5-star label category, which also limits the incentives to develop much more efficient products. So this kind of ladder approach really helps to set the long-term targets and create the market in the long term, also communicate with manufacturers and industry to show what are the updates which are coming up so the industry has time and can build capacity to adapt to these requirements. My last chart, just another example from Indonesia on how important this ladder approach is. Indonesia has developed a new label rating in last year. And you can see that if you look at the top two bars for 5 and 4 stars labels for air conditioners, the percentage shows how many appliances on the market fall within those two categories. And we can see that it's about 1/3 of the market is above new 3-star level already at the moment of enforcing this new standards. So it's again quite a lot of market is compliant with a high level efficiency rating, which means that it needs to be further incentivized with the regulation in order to improve the efficiency of the appliances across the market. So with that, I will stop here and happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation and that overview of your roadmap. We're looking forward to hosting the discussion afterwards. I'm sure there'll be questions. Up next, we have Prima Mada from Natural Resources Defense Fund, who will be presenting on some of the cool roof solutions in India that she's been working on. So thank you. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Michaela. A very good evening, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. It is indeed a pleasure to be talking to you all, and thank you to WRI for organizing this virtual discussion on a very pertinent topic and really bringing us together to exchange some valuable lessons. So a bit of an introduction. I represent Natural Resources Defense Council's India program, and we have been engaging at national and state level on implementation of building energy efficiency since over a decade in India. It has also been a very enriching experience to partner with the Building Efficiency Accelerator platform and working towards the increase in uptake of efficiency policies and programs in building sector, both globally and in India. Now, today I'll be talking about our initiative of working with cities on implementation of passive cooling technology, both from the perspective of the building resilience to extreme heat and energy savings. Next slide, please. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Kela. Just to put things a bit of a perspective on the topic of the current session on sustainable cooling, and especially in the context of India, how cooling matters, and especially in the context of threat to the climate. Lily had kind of laid the ground earlier on, but the first graph here, really one of the main problems is the rising temperatures and which is a deadly threat. Now this chart on the left demonstrates that and how really heat kills. Through our work, we have been looking on protecting the vulnerable communities from extreme heat. And I'll explain that a bit more in the next slide. And the second huge threat is the skyrocketing cooling demand, which is projected to grow 8 times by 2038 by India Cooling Action Plan, which was released in 2019, which is really a document that brings together the different aspects of cooling and has kind of brought the topic of cooling to the to the policymakers' attention, and it's one of its kind document, one of the first initiatives around the world to really look at cooling in a more comprehensive way. Now, India right now has less than 10, very low penetration of air conditioners. Less than 10% of the households really own an air conditioner, whereas in China it is 94%. Now, this number is going to skyrocket in India, and if it is done with HFCs and inefficient air conditioners, that is going to be lethal for the climate. And also, while this is a challenge, there is also huge opportunity to really avoid emissions through more efficient cooling by 2050. Now, the third component is really through rapid development and an emerging economy. Really, 70% of buildings in India that will exist in 2030 are yet to be built. So it's really important to build smart from start and include technologies, passive cooling technologies, right from the beginning. And here we have been focusing on our work with Bureau of Energy Efficiency and states on implementation of the Energy Conservation Building Code. And I would just want to also highlight now, the pandemic has really shown us what is the, the emphasis on planning, which planning ahead that cannot be really emphasized enough, how we really need to plan, in a more comprehensive way to avoid higher cost later, and also lock in, lower energy savings from the start. Next slide, please. Moving a bit towards extreme heat, which further accentuates the need for cooling. Now, we know, and we have experienced it again this year, that climate change is fueling frequent and intense and more longer heat waves. I mean, cities and countries which had not really seen this, rising temperatures earlier on are now really witnessing that globally. So NRDC, and with a broad set of partners, we work with government leaders and key experts across India and internationally to develop and launch and implement the heat action plans. Now, these plans are basically comprehensive plans for building resilience to extreme heat events through public awareness and community outreach, early warning system and interagency coordination mechanism, capacity building amongst the healthcare professionals, and reducing heat exposures and promoting adaptive measures. So public health really is the core of these action plans. Our plans is really focused on how one can look at protecting health from extreme heat. Ahmedabad was the first city to develop the heat action plan back in 2013, working with local partners in the Institute of Public Health, Gandhinagar, Natural Resources Defense Council. And a peer-reviewed study later on, kind of explained and estimated that nearly 1,200 deaths each year were avoided after implementing the heat action plan in Ahmedabad. Now, since then, the heat action plan has now expanded to over 23 states and 100 cities and districts in India through the leadership of the national agency, the National Disaster Management Authority. So heat action plan is really an example of work that how action at a city, at a state level or at a city level can really be scaled up at a national level. So this is a good example of that piece. An important component of heat action plan, which also includes now, is cool roofs as a resilience strategy to extreme heat. And I will turn to that topic now. Next slide, please. Great. So with a particular focus on vulnerable communities, we have been engaging with cities and state for wide-scale implementation of cool roofs. Now, cool roofs programs which are implemented at scale can potentially work towards reducing the cooling demand through energy savings in air-conditioned buildings, and also through in unconditioned building by providing better comfort and therefore kind of reducing the need for cooling. Now, ICAP, the India Cooling Action Plan, has also identified cool roofs and localized heat action plan as a key strategy to enable cooling and thermal comfort, especially for the economically weaker section. Just to talk about a bit of cool roofs now. Now, cool roofs are, they offer a simple and a very cost-effective solution at times to urbanization challenges. Now, we know that an important component of a building which has direct impact on its energy consumption and thermal comfort is the roof. So cool roofs really function primarily by reflecting more sunlight, which is incident on the roof, back to the atmosphere than a regular roof. And therefore, with lesser heat absorption, it makes more comfortable for the room beneath that roof in terms of temperatures. Now, in 2017 and 2018, the cities of Ahmedabad and Hyderabad in India, they initiated pilot cool roof programs really focused on vulnerable communities. The picture here on the right really, shows one of the household owners in one of the low-income communities in Ahmedabad, here, Meena Ben. Here we implemented cool roofs with our local partners, Mahila Housing Trusts, with a solar reflective white paint. Now, she kind of told us and discussed and mentioned to us her experience of how it felt after the roof was painted white, painted with a solar reflective paint versus us. Well, she said it became more comfortable to be indoors, between peak heat hours of 2 to 4 p.m. So this was the direct, a beneficiary of cool roof really talking about her experience and therefore leading to enhanced productivity, because a lot of these women also work from home. Children studying during those, afternoon hours, especially, was made more comfortable. Next slide, please. So just a quick emphasis on what are the benefits of cool roofs. Now, several studies have analyzed the impact of cool roofs on indoor room temperatures and observed that it lowers the temperatures to about 2 to 2 to 5 degrees. These studies have also been taken by Indian research institutes such as the Indian Institute of International Institute of Technology in Hyderabad, the CEPT University, that have been analyzing the pilots that have been undertaken. Now, these 3 boxes here largely mention the benefits, of cool roofs for an air-conditioned building, for an unconditioned building, and even at a city level. And these range from potential energy savings, so thermal comfort, to enhanced productivity, and at a large scale, leading to reduction in urban heat island effect on a long-term basis. Now, can we move to the next slide? Yes, please. Yeah. These slides are all over. They don't, my apologies for that. They are not depicting the earlier, the formatting is all over. But so just to talk about the materials, there are a range of cool roof materials that are available in the market, differing in cost and durability. And the typical cool roofs include, coated cool roofs, which involve a coating of a material or a paint with high reflectivity, and a membrane roof, which consists of prefabricated materials, tiles and China mosaic, and also green roof. Now, the choice of an appropriate material really depends on the specific context for some of the factors, such as the existing roof material, the life and maintenance, availability, the cost, and the time needed for installation, and availability of skilled labor to kind of install that roof. So these are some of the factors that are involved. The cost of these roofs typically vary from, say, rupees, 20 rupees for a cool paint to about 100 rupees per square feet for a tile or a membrane. And the manufacturers kind of claim to have payback of 2 to 2.5 years. The coating is typically required, which is a solar reflective paint, is typically required to be reapplied every 4 to 5 years. But over the long run, combining energy savings with reduced roof maintenance and reduced mean maintenance and energy saving, it offers a very good bargain. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, these are just examples of some of the roofs that have been implemented traditionally in India. So it's not a new concept, so to say, that it has now come to surface, but it has been applied in traditional architecture. Next slide, please. Again, these are just examples of current applications. I'm going to skip and move to the next slide. Next slide, please. Now, the studies have undertaken to assess the impact of cool roofs. These are studies which have been performed in India. And as I mentioned, the first bit here really talks about an air-conditioned building in Hyderabad, which led to kind of savings to 20 to 22 kilowatt hour per meter square per year, around 14 to 26% of savings. In a city of Ahmedabad, cool roof in a low-income household showed a reduction of nearly 3 degrees in indoor temperature, which lowered the indoor temperature in peak summers. Next slide. Similarly, there have been studies that have estimated impact on an unconditioned building, where the impact has been observed more in terms of the thermal comfort, and it observed that number of comfort hours increased by 30 to 23% in these buildings. I will just draw your attention to the figure on the right. Now, this is an example of a study which kind of examined the impact on a large-scale basis and a reduction in urban heat island. Now, cool roofs were implemented at a city-wide level, as I mentioned, have shown an impact on reduction in urban heat island. This is a place in Meria, a semi-arid region in South Spain, where the farmers typically paint their roofs before the onset of a summer season with a white paint. On examining that, there was a difference in temperature of about 0.3 degrees in this area versus a neighboring city which had no cool roofs, which in fact had a higher temperature of 0.5 degrees over a 20-year period. So clearly this leads to a long-term impact on urban heat island reduction. Next slide, please. I just wanted to also highlight here where that NRDC and partners, we have just completed a new research which talks about, for the city of Ahmedabad, that what is the impact of cool roofs on the cooling demand. So this study kind of projected the cooling demand for Ahmedabad city and kind of examined that if the cool roofs were to increase from 5% to 20% in the city over by 2030, it would lead to a reduction in energy demand, a cooling energy demand of 0.21 terawatt hours. Now, this number by itself seems to be small, but this is almost equivalent to the study examines the additional additional need for cooling because of a rising cooling demand as a result of higher temperature. So in that sense that it only by achieving 20%, you're able to offset that additional cooling demand because of an increase in temperature by 2030. So this will soon be released in a couple of weeks. Next slide. This is an example of a cool roof program which was implemented in New York City. I will not go in details. This is just to showcase that there are examples of cool roofs which have been implemented at an international level. Next slide, please. Okay, wow, this is all over the place, the formatting, but so this slide was to highlight how the cities in India can lead the way. In 2017 and 18, both cities of Ahmedabad and Hyderabad implemented cool roofs. This was on low-income housing that showcased, which created the local evidence base in terms of the temperature, lowering of temperatures in these households from 2 to 4 degrees. Now, building on these pilots and the robust evidence base that was created at a local level, we worked with these cities to draw up a kind of a scale-up plan for Telangana. We call it like making Telangana a cool state. Now, this was largely designed to, scale up cool roofs across all buildings and devising financial, regulatory, and awareness and outreach mechanism that would be required by each building type. And also designing an institutional structure for this program. Next slide, please. Here, I just wanted to mention that what's the process we follow. So to develop a Telangana Cool Roof program based on local evidence base, we work with partners to develop this program. It had several steps. First, understanding what is the local evidence base, then working with stakeholders to seek feedback on what and also the barriers to potential cool roof at scale. And also survey in terms of what is the availability of cool roof material in the state where the city is. And to implement at scale, we also thought it is important to have a robust interagency coordination mechanism of who will do what, which would be the primary agency that would be responsible, and to show kind of accountability within the state. And this program was out for public commenting a year and a half back, which was to be released last year, but COVID set things off track. But we're hoping to have this released by end of this year. If we go to the next slide. So making Telangana a cool state, this was basically designed with the objective of driving rapid statewide adoption of cool roofs, designing an interagency coordination mechanism, identifying the financing and outreach and awareness generation tools that will go with each building type, and a workforce development and training and capacity building. Now, we designed this program based on 3 building types: government and commercial program, which was where the driver is really the energy savings and thermal comfort, and mandating it for these particular building segments. The residential program was more voluntary in nature, and where the biggest driver is thermal comfort. And this we thought would come along once there is evidence created at government and commercial buildings level. And finally, the vulnerable communities program, where this has to be adopted by the city and really work with the lower income communities to implement it on CSR funding basis for the vulnerable communities. Next slide, please. We can skip this slide. This is basically kind of highlighting what are the regulatory policy and the funding tools that were designed specific to each building type for implementing cool roofs. Next slide. This slide shows an example of what kind of outreach was done. So there were billboards that were placed across the city of Ahmedabad, showcasing or showing the impact of cool roofs, largely to spread awareness on what that a roof. What is the talking about the technology and what kind of an impact you can have. So this is extremely important and has to be inbuilt into a city and a state level program on cool roofs through various mechanisms, including Resident Welfare Association, for example. Spreading the word through flyers, posters, through radio jingles would be. And we are in the process of working with the state of Telangana and Ahmedabad to design some of these tools to go along with a citywide program. Can we have the next slide? This is an institutional mechanism that was developed as part of the program for Telangana, housing it in the municipal administration department and working with the city government. Next slide, please. This is an example that the program was to be in a phased-wise manner. starting with a focus on vulnerable communities and then moving to commercial and government buildings, and finally the residential buildings to come along in the latter part. We spread this across 10 years for implementation of cool roofs across the state and cities. Next slide, please. Next slide. Just a slide before. Yeah. Just to give you an idea about this, now we have kind of done these demonstration in 4 additional cities, and we are in the city of Jodhpur, Surat, Bhopal, and Ahmedabad, again focused on low-income communities. And here we are focused on working with the city governments to look at scaling these up. One important development which happened last year was in our efforts to scale this program, we worked with the National Disaster Management Authority to design a cool roof challenge where NDMA invited states and cities to announce targets for implementing cool roofs, and getting a recognition from NDMA in doing so. So this was released last year, but of course COVID derailed things, and we are hoping to re-release it in next year to encourage more of states and cities to come forward. Thank you. This was my last slide. I'm sorry for this absurd formatting of the slides. Thank you.
Thank you, Prima. I appreciate your presentation. I'm sorry about the formatting as well. I think something happened there. That was a really insightful and exciting project. And now we're going to go to see what the solutions are for the commercial and industrial buildings. We have Andrea Voigt from Danfoss Climate Solutions, who is Global Head of Public Affairs, joining us to speak on this. Thank you, Andrea, for joining us today.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm trying to share my screen. Wait a second. Here it is. Okay, you see the screen?
Yep.
Do you hear me and do you see the screen? Okay, good.
Yeah, you might want to do presentation mode, but yes.
I did actually, so. Do you see it in presentation mode now, or? Because on my screen it is presentation mode, so.
It's still in PowerPoint mode. Maybe it will fix.
Wait a second, I'll go back. I will try again. Wait. I do this first. I don't think I can. Maybe here. No. Okay. It's presentation mode for me, for you? Still not?
It's still not. Mm-mm.
Well, then I would, it's, yeah.
If you see,
We can share
from
from
the swap screens.
Screens. Yeah, maybe that's here. Still not?
Still not. Mm-mm.
Zoom is always a challenge. Try again. Now for me, this is the slideshow. If I swap screens. No, apparently not.
Still no. We can share them for you.
Well, share them then. I made a few changes, but nothing very dramatic. So I'll just say stop share here. And then you just put it on. Okay. Yeah, I've got it. Okay, thank you. So my name is Andrea Vogt, indeed. And yeah, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to present at this webinar, which is extremely timely given the heat waves that we are currently experiencing, and not only experiencing in Asian countries, but also in countries as trivial as Belgium or Germany or France. So really very timely and important topic to tackle. Next slide, please. So first of all, I just wanted to draw the attention on the importance of energy. I think it's clear to everybody, and it also became very clear in the IEA's presentation beforehand, that energy is really the one big topic that we need to tackle, also if we want to tackle climate change, and of course now as well in terms of energy security, which has become increasingly important. What you also see on the pie chart is the small share that F-gases have in the overall emission picture, in the overall greenhouse gas emission picture. That does not mean that it's not important to tackle F-gases, because it's the fastest growing greenhouse gas. But then on the other hand, it's being tackled under the Kigali Amendment and various national regulations as well. So some very targeted action going on here. But energy is really the elephant in the room. And as we start to work on energy and to address different energy solutions, this will also drive the need for a whole range of other factors, including but not limited to, for example, the decarbonization of electricity as we go on electrifying heating and cooling and transport. It'll drive the need for energy efficiency and many other topics, which I'm not going to address in detail here. What I also wanted to really point out is that cooling and air conditioning, people tend to think immediately about small residential air conditioners, and people immediately think about developing countries and how important in very hot climate zones. But actually this is really changing. It's not only very important, as I was saying in the beginning, for very hot climate zones, it's also increasingly important for climate zones that need both heating and cooling. And we see that the number of cooling days in inverted commas is increasing also in those climate zones, which actually drives the need from only looking at the efficiency of a small residential air conditioner, for example, towards a more system-based approach, which is what I would like to talk about today in this presentation. Next slide, please. So buildings have a key role to play. This is just one graph. I found there are many others which are available that shows how important buildings are. 1/3 of the total final energy consumption are represented by buildings. And there we are talking about thermal energy and about electrical energy. We will see the electrical part grow as we start electrifying the heating side of things specifically. But altogether, a very important share of the energy consumption by buildings goes to heating and cooling. Generally speaking, it's something like over 80% of the energy consumed by buildings is for heating and cooling. So once again, a strong argument to really address these important sectors in the building space. We also know that the cooling demand, and I think that became very clear also in the presentation about the Asian countries, is growing very, very, very fast. It's the fastest of any energy end use in buildings, with 4% annually. And if you look at this on a global scale, it's really massive, which is why it is so important to tackle this application. Next slide, please. So what we really do need, this also screwed up the presentation mode. So the formatting, it looked actually quite nice on the original one. So this is really to point out the need for an integrated approach, and not only look at the appliance in itself or the air conditioner in itself, but also to see this in a bigger system. And what I tried to visualize here is to really show those 3 big pillars that we have to look at if we want to limit global warming. warming to 1.5 degrees. And if we want to really achieve the energy transition and phase out the fossil fuels, of course, in the middle here, the decarbonization of heating and cooling, which represent roughly half of the total final energy consumption globally, and with nearly 90% still based on fossil fuels. So hence, big need to act here. And then we also have the electricity side of things, which is extremely important as we electrify heating and cooling, and which today is also still based with a 70% roughly on fossil fuels. And then of course transport, which is another elephant in the room, like with a nearly, well, 96% still based on fossil fuels. So we have really these three items on which we need to act, these three big pillars, with heating and cooling being right in the middle if we want to achieve our climate and energy goals here. How to do that is really to bring together the renewables and the energy efficiency. We really need both, and they both need to play together. We can't just do the one without the other, and there is absolutely no competition between the two. Really, the two need to complement each other. And if we go then one level down and look at specifically heating and cooling, then we would have district-based solutions where we look at a more systemic approach. And then we would have heat pumps meaning here appliances that do both heating and cooling. And also, and that's another thing which really is important to be kept in mind, a heat pump is not necessarily, or an air conditioner for that matter, is not only existing in very small residential formats. There are very big solutions. And specifically when looking at district energy, there are really very big heat pumps and chillers that work in that context and can provide either district heating or district cooling or both. So in a system approach, this is a really important message to be kept in mind. And then we have those different factors on which we can work, including the excess heat recovery from cooling installations, for example, in terms of controls and balancing and part load conditions, where the whole digitalization really comes into play, including building automation and control systems that really help to optimize the performance of heating and cooling equipment. And then finally, the entire complex related to the buildings, where, for example, we just heard about the cool roofs, but which also includes a number of other factors. And if we do take such a district-based approach, such a system-based approach, we will have quite a number of advantages also that are not necessarily only related to the heating and cooling in itself, but that also go much further. Like, for example, this can accelerate the phase-in of renewables in terms of providing flexibility. If you have a system, then of course you have much more possibility to play, in inverted commas, with a storage and with flexibility to mitigate peak loads, for example, and also to combine this with heat pumps. That saves energy in turn, it reduces the cost, and also an important factor is the air quality. Like, if you are in a city, and I think it was mentioned beforehand, and if you have many small air conditioners running at full speed everywhere, then this also creates a lot of heat. And that heat increases the temperature in the city, and then we enter really a vicious circle. So that's a strong case also for a system-based approach, and in that case for district cooling. And a number of other advantages, which I'm going to explain a bit more in detail in the following slides. Next slide, please. So this is one example, and that's why I'm saying we do not necessarily only need to talk about very hot climate zones. If we talk about a systems-based approach, we can also talk about climate zones in Europe, where this makes total sense. And here in this case, it's just one example taken from our campus from Danfoss in Norborg in Denmark, where, and without going into bigger detail here, but what I want to show here is that we have different applications which require heating or cooling or both. And from those applications, we recover the excess energy then it runs through a heat exchange station, and then that energy can be used, for example, directly, in this case, to heat the Danfoss headquarters, or can also be used to heat sanitary water, for example, or it can be fed into a district energy network, in this case specifically into the district energy network of the municipality, and which then, of course, heats the homes of the people living there. And you can do the same sort of systemic approach also with cooling. Next slide, please. So more zooming in on the heat pumps in itself. And as I said, there are not only small heat pumps, there are also big heat pumps, and they all have the same huge advantages. Those advantages being the combination of energy efficiency, plus using renewable heat sources, plus using decarbonized electricity if the electricity is decarbonized. And if you combine those three, then you would have zero emission heating and cooling. Obviously, if the electricity is completely decarbonized, then the final result is also completely decarbonized. But even if the electricity is not fully decarbonized, still the heat pump will provide a lot of advantage in terms of emission reduction, because it is so energy efficient, because basically it uses the energy which is available in the ambient, in the ground, in the water, in the air, and then upgrades it to the required temperature levels, or vice versa, to cool. Next slide, please. What is less known in this respect is that we can really even make more use of those synergies, and that really brings this heating and cooling side together, which I was mentioning earlier, because we will need cooling in more and more climate zones around the globe, even where it's not being necessary today, it will become more and more necessary. So using those synergies between heating and cooling really play an increasingly important role. And this, also without going into bigger details, is to show that if we really play this intelligently and use this synergy between heating and cooling, we can really have a major gain in terms of efficiency. In this example here, we would, if you compare an air-cooled chiller on its own, it would have a certain coefficient of performance for the cooling only. If you then use a heat pump, which does only heating, it also will have a certain coefficient of performance, which in itself here is already pretty high. But if you combine the two of them together, then you would have a really, really interesting, attractive coefficient of performance, which is much higher than of the two separate ones. And in a very simplified way, how this works is that you would have a really big heat pump or chiller, and that would then, on the one hand side, cool, provide the cooling which is required, and on the other hand side, recover the excess heat from the cooling, upgrade it, and then make sure that it can be used for heating purposes. So it really brings the two together for a very big increase in energy efficiency, which, as we saw in the beginning of the presentation, is increasingly important if we are serious about decarbonization and also about energy security. And next slide, please.
Excuse me, would you mind wrapping up your presentation
Yes,
a little
I do.
earlier? Thank you.
I do. I'm nearly there, actually. So this is just a summary on showing how this can be used. If we look really at critical facility cooling, and that can be hospitals or food retail or data centers, etc., and how those symbiosis advantages can be used across the board and increase the efficiency. Next slide. And then a final word on refrigerants, because I was explicitly asked to say something on the refrigerants. So without going into greater detail here, it shows once again that system thinking is really of key importance also when it comes to refrigerants. We absolutely have to bring down the global warming potential of the refrigerants. And for that, we have a number of frameworks, including the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol. But then we also have to think about the efficiency if we do this. And we have a true window of opportunity with the Kigali Amendment to combine the two, to bring down the global warming potential and to increase the energy efficiency. And on the graph, it can be seen clearly how much emissions we can abate if we really work on both, on energy efficiency, on moving away from fossil fuels, and on reducing global warming potential. So there is a huge potential here. And I think then we have a last slide. So in summary, we have 3 top priorities. We need to be energy efficient and in an active way and in a smart way. And here digitalization plays a very important role. 2, integrating the sectors and make sure we use the synergies between heating and cooling. We will also be able then to increase the operational efficiency and flexibility, and also to mitigate peak loads, which will be increasingly important. Also, if you look at the many small air conditioners that are going to be used. So peak load mitigation, key criterion here. And we have to move to renewable energies. And for that, we should not think in silos, but bring it all together, work together between governments and also industry, develop master plans and have a mandatory energy mapping and excess heat recovery to make this happen on the ground. And you can skip the last one. That's just an overview of Danfoss. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea. That was an excellent presentation about systems thinking. And next, I know we're running a little over time here, but we do have Demetrios Karamitos here, who's joining us from the Basel Agency for Sustainable Energy and is going to be speaking on cooling as a service. So thinking about those financing mechanisms for how we can integrate cooling. Thank you.
Many thanks, Kayla, and thank you as well to the World Resource Institute for the opportunity to present today and to tackling that important topic. And I take the opportunity as well to thank all of the panelists for all of their work that they're doing in this important matter. So I'll quickly share my screen. Let me know if you can see it.
Yes, we can see it. It's not in presentation mode though.
Yeah. Is it now in presentation mode?
Yes, excellent.
Super. In the interest of time, I'll try to run a little bit quickly through the slides, but just for the audience to know a little bit about who the Basel Agency for Sustainable Energy is. We are a non-for-profit foundation based in Switzerland. We were founded about 20 years ago by the Swiss government and the city of Basel, and we are a specialized partner of the UN Environment Program. So what do? We really focus on developing innovative financial mechanisms and financial structures to help accelerate investments into energy efficiency, renewable energy, and climate-driven solutions. So we typically work with, for instance, between the private sector and the public sector, with solution providers, governments, private equity funds, development banks, and so on. And we focus really on a different range of areas of work, which goes really from, as I mentioned, renewable energy, but energy efficiency can tackle solutions like heating, cooling, lighting, storage of energy, electric mobility as well, land use, adaptation and resilience, and climate finance. And one area which we're doing more and more work is also circular economy, because we really see that it goes hand in hand in all of the other sectors and accelerating our transition to a more climate resilient future. So activities of BASE are really around the world, but I'll skip this rather quickly. And also on this slide to mention a few figures of why we focused on the cooling sector. About, I would say we started work in this industry really 4 to 5 years ago. And I won't repeat the data of our other panelists, which were really crucial. But really what we see, and I'll echo this, is that this industry is really booming and we cannot stop the growth of this industry. And what is really even more urgent is, and it has been mentioned by our panelists, is that whether we are a business or whether we are a private user, we see from the data, and this is actually also data shared by the IEA, that businesses engage with systems that are typically between 40 to 60% less energy efficient than the systems that have access to their own markets. And this, even though the benefits of energy efficiency, whether you look at cooling or also heating, but it also tackles other solutions in the market, the benefits of energy efficiency are really crystal clear. So typically, if you look at cooling, 3/4 of the costs of a system, when you look at the life cycle of this system, is related to the operation of that system. So energy usage, water, maintenance, and so on. But even though this is the selling cost represents a fraction of this overall cost, users and businesses engage with systems that are cheaper to buy upfront. And some of the barriers that we see, demand market barriers that we see of why this is happening, is really can be summarized in 4 barriers. It's first the upfront investment cost. So systems which are more innovative, using, for instance, clean refrigerants and that are more energy efficient, are more expensive to buy upfront. There is also, of course, and this is very understandable, a lack of trust in performance. So when you're a buyer, you're not an expert in those technologies, so you rely on other experts, and you rely also in the trust in the entity selling you those solutions. And then typically, if you're a business, let's say you're a supermarket, you're a hotel, you have offices, or you have an industrial facility, you have priorities in investing. So for instance, if it's a hotel, you're going to make the hotel more pretty, more appealing for your customers, instead of investing into a more energy efficient cooling system. And then typically also there is a lack of trust in maintenance and spare parts. So what we've seen typically, to give you an example briefly, there was a customer in the airport industry that had engaged with innovative system. It was not in this example a cooling solution. It was rather a system core into their operations, and the system had operation issue, and it took more than 2 months to repair that system. So as a result, the customer then really, for new purchases, they're really having this trust issue. So what we saw in the market is really a strong opportunity to deploy the model, what we call servitization. What is servitization? Is a model that has been actually applied in many, many other industries before looking at cooling or heating per se. So for instance, it's very common with solar panels. So today, typically as a consumer, instead of buying the solar panels, you can sign a PPA, so power purchase agreements, whereby you're going to really pay per usage of kilowatt hour for the solar panels. And so we took that concept and we applied it to cooling and heating. And today, actually, this graph is from more than 2 years ago. And I'm very happy to say that heating and cooling is already further up in the core curve of maturity in this industry. So what is the model? Really, it's a shift from customers of buying assets to paying per use of cooling. So it's really a shift from a CapEx to an OpEx model. And it really aligns the incentives for efficient production and efficient consumption between the user and the solution provider. So from one side, the solution provider has really the incentive to implement the solution that is reliable and energy efficient, because they're selling an output to the end customer who, from their perspective, have also the incentive to implement the more energy efficient system, because it ends up being the cheaper to pay for. Because if you look and compare apple to apple, suddenly a system that is really not energy efficient is going to be much more expensive on a monthly basis, because the cost is going to incorporate, for instance, cost of maintenance, implementation, energy cost, water consumption costs. So as a result, of course, the more energy efficient system is going to be much more price competitive. Just to compare a little bit with different models on the market, and there I'd like to echo what Andrea mentioned. For instance, district heating and cooling is really a strong solution to go for cities that have the opportunity to implement such infrastructures. But of course, in some areas, you don't have the ability from a land perspective to implement district heating. So there, the difference is that cooling as a service is more, how to say, decentralized district heating or cooling, whereby one system can provide heating or cooling to several buildings or one building per se, but not an entire city. So also from an investment perspective, it's smaller investments. The difference with an ESCO model is that it's not guaranteed on savings. So the customer really pays per consumption. And very briefly, I also mentioned, it's not mentioned on this slide, but the difference with a leasing model is that when a customer engages on a leasing contract for a system, that customer still bears the risks of that system because they end up owning the technology. Whereas on cooling as a service, the risk is really with the solution provider, meaning that suddenly if the system is not working, the customer is not paying for the service they're signing up for. So just very high level, who are the actors involved? Of course, you have the users who benefit from direct access to high technology. They have no performance risks. They have no capital expenditure upfront. And I'll run through this very briefly. The solution provider have really the incentive to deploy the most innovative solutions they have in their portfolio. And also within an existing contract with the customer, they have the incentive to keep innovating, because the more efficient they are, the more their profit margin will be for the solution they provide. And it's also, it's not mentioned here in the slide, but it's engaging the solution providers to think long-term, and therefore, for instance, implement clean refrigerants that will be aligned with the regulations 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road, or even 10 years down the road. And it's also enforcing them to think in a circular economy perspective, so that each part can be substituted within a subsystem rather more quickly and effectively. And for the financiers, of course, what it is, it's an opportunity to invest into green projects and projects which are also low risk, because these technologies are very mature on the market and they're very long-term operational. So for financiers that look to, for instance, decarbonize their scope 3, it's a very interesting market to tackle. I'll skip through this rather quickly, and I'll show the crowd some examples. So here, for instance, you have one of our partners based in Singapore that implemented a project in India, several of them, but this is an example. Their name is called CARE, and they enabled for a real estate complex to shift from day one to energy efficient cooling device, which was, I think, more than 20% increase in efficiency. And today I can confirm that that system runs with an improvement of 30%, and it's fully solar powered. So especially with a country that is dependent on a grid which is coal powered, this is really enabling a strong solution to decarbonize the market quickly. Here you have an example in Colombia with cooling as a service, supplying cooling in office buildings. And again, here, the solution enabled for a decrease of greenhouse gas emissions of 440 tons of CO2 equivalent per year. And here, this is the third example. I could go on and on, but just for the matter of time, I'll shift quickly. It's a partner in South Africa called Energy Partners Refrigeration that has been really scaling up applications of cooling as a service, and again, powered by solar energy, which also for a grid which is typically powered by coal and that is unreliable because they have often blackouts, it's super appealing, of course, for customers because it lowers their risks of operation. How did we support the market? As the Basel Agency for Sustainable Energy, we really acted on 4 pillars. The first one is the development of tools. So what are tools is, for instance, standardized contracts, pricing models, financial structures for those entities to engage with cooling as a service. So how do you supply cooling as a service? How do you shift from selling assets to selling services? The second pillar is a lot of capacity building. So we build an alliance of more than today 75 or 78 members on board that really support that model. And I'm very happy to actually mention that Danfoss is part of this alliance. We supported projects around the world with really like expert advices on how to deploy servitization. And we raised a lot of awareness to doing webinars, case studies, videos, and all of this is actually available online for free. And we launched recently what we call the SET Alliance, which is the Global Servitization for Energy Transition Alliance. And if you're interested to know more about this alliance on how to apply cooling as a service and also this model in other activities like heating, lighting, energy storage, I invite you to check the website and reach out. And this is, of course, one solution among others on the market. But indeed, time is of essence, and we really have to go fast. So there we go. I'll stop here, and I'll give you back the screen, Kayla. Many thanks.
Thanks, Demetrius. That was great overview of the cooling as a service project. I know that we're over time. I'm a little unclear on whether our panelists would like to proceed with a Q&A or if we should close out. Any opinions here? Lily, you'd be leading.
I'm here and I'm happy to do so, but I don't know if all of our panelists are still here, and I think it's up to them, really.
For me, it's okay.
All right. Does that work for you, Prima and Dimitris? Great. All right. Lily's going to be moderating a quick discussion. I know we had a couple of questions come through in the chat that our panelists were able to answer, but Lily, would you like to guide this conversation?
Sure. I just would like you to, if you could start my video. It says it's been disabled. In any case, I can start. So is everybody here? Just so I know, it's Andrea, Dimitris, Ksenia, and Prima.
Ksenia actually was unable to continue. So
okay, all right, okay. All right. So why don't we start with you, Prima? So I think your presentation was really interesting, particularly about, you know, the discussion of cool roofs. You mentioned planning. I know you mentioned also the significant impact of some of the measures in cooling demand reduction in terms of energy. And I know also from many studies that, like, if you reduce 1 degree, I think drop in urban heat island effect, you have a reduction of peak power by 2 to 4%. So supporting what some of the other figures that you told us about the terawatt hours, etc. How we see that, like, as you've given the example in India, governments are taking this seriously. They're creating new heat action plans, developing roadmaps, heating officers in some cases. How do you think these efforts can be, you know, connected to the larger net zero building goals in countries and cities? And are there examples that you can think of or give us and the guests? Over to you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you so much, Lily, for that question. Yeah, I think it's just a little step backwards. I think in the past couple of years, the profile of cooling as a topic has really risen, you know, and it has now come in front of national policymakers. Like, for example, in India, the India Cooling Action Plan really brings together different stakeholders, and what it emphasizes on are how some of the recommendations of plan or some of the efforts at more climate friendly cooling can be incorporated in the ongoing programs and schemes of the government. And then we go beyond that if it is required too. So now that has happened at the national level. Now there are people from different departments talking at the same level, but the time has now come to really take it to at the state and a city level. I'll give you an example. I was in a state of Chhattisgarh last week, and what is important is for these states and cities to see how they are contributing to the overall India's climate vision. And I remember one of the senior policymakers asking me in last week that we were talking about building energy codes there. He said, if our state was to comply with the building energy codes, how much would we contribute to India's the five pillars that Prime Minister Modi had announced in last year? So connecting that state and city level effort to say that this is the emissions that you are reducing through your efforts, and this is how your state and city policies talk to the national policy or the national goals, I think would be very important. And then linking it with the overall vision of going net zero by 2070 for India. So I think that's important. Other is also we need to take a more holistic look. For example, in states in India, now we are talking about bringing the renewable and energy efficiency efforts in the same sphere and talking about clean energy transition plans. So combining the efforts and moving towards a common vision is important, and and not working in silos is something would be critical.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think India has been a really good example of trying to bring together those various stakeholders and take that comprehensive approach through the National India Cooling Action Plan. So big congratulations on that as well. Maybe I can move to you, and Andrea. and Dimitris. I guess in your experience, I mean, we know that a lot of the cooling transition will rest on the private sector's innovation as well, and private sector sort of stepping up to deliver the solutions that we know exist in the market today. What, in your experience, have been successful strategies to encourage private sector partners to invest and implement these solutions? And how do you think this can be linked to decarbonizing the building portfolio? Maybe Andrea, you can go first.
Yeah, okay. Well, am I unmuted? Yes, I am. Yeah, thanks, Lily, for the question. I think what is, well, always very important for the private sector is regulatory certainty, so that you know basically how the context is going to evolve, and that then also gives you the security and the certainty where you want to invest and how to invest. So I think that's certainly a key element there. And the cooling plans, for example, are a very important milestone there, cooling or heating plans, so that we know into which direction the market is going to go and where the governments are going to put their priorities. That's one. And then two, what we also see is, and I mentioned that on the last slide of my presentation, is the importance of governments and industry really working together, so that you wouldn't have a government which just comes up with a catalog of rules which are not synchronized or not at all discussed with industry and in terms of the technical solutions that are available. And if I'm talking specifically about the system-based approach, this really gets even more important, because what you really need to make this happen is a planning where you bring the different stakeholders together, where you make a plan. So this is my city, this is my municipality, or this is my district. I want to make sure that this district is going to be decarbonized, or that it uses low carbon heating or cooling. So therefore, where do I need the heat? Where do I need the cold? Can I connect it? And can I use the synergies between the two of them? And in order to get there, you need to have a sort of master plan, which brings together at the same table the mayor or the municipality, the energy planners, the industry, the installers, the consultants, etc., to really put this in place together, and then with clear milestones. And that comes then back to the certainty also that is needed. So I think that's a key point which really comes to my mind. And then finance, and I think Dimitris already said a lot about this, of overcoming the initial investment cost, which is often a big barrier, the capex, which kind of stands in the way of moving towards more energy efficient solutions. So their servitization or I don't know how you pronounce that actually, servitization or whatever. So is really an important step, of course, because then you take away the high investment cost and you move it more to the operational savings, which is another key aspect. Skills, have the right people, the installers, to be able to make it happen. Awareness, understanding about the solutions that are out there. So these are some points that come to mind.
Yeah, thanks so much, Andrea. And I mean, on the master planning, this is a very important point. I think we've heard this across all presentations today, that this is important, some kind of demand mapping and master planning at the urban level. Have you seen, just in your experience from the private sector, national roadmaps that can also help this kind of investment? So sort of a national mapping of heat sources or cooling demand that can equally support private sector engagement? Or do you think it always has to be complemented with a detailed master plan?
No, what I think is, if I'm just taking an example from Europe, but it can be transferred anywhere actually, is that there is currently a strong move towards making energy maps mandatory. So that basically in a city with a certain number of, with a certain population, right now what is being proposed is I think it's 35,000 people or something. They are obliged to come up with an energy map for their municipality, which is actually the very first step to see if there is a scope and potential to take a more system-based approach, a district-based approach. So, and then once a city does this map, then you can, of course, then you can develop your master plan. You can say, okay, this is where, if I'm taking the example I gave in the presentation, if you say, okay, here I'm having a critical facility, it's a hospital, for example, and that hospital absolutely needs cooling. What is in the surrounding of that hospital? Are there buildings that need heating, for example? Can I use the excess heat from the cooling and then feed it into the district and then use it for the buildings? But in order to make that plan, then you first need to really assess, where do I need the cooling and what is around it, and can I connect the dots? So
Thanks, Andrea. And I think in Europe, it's also interesting, the heat roadmap that was developed. And I think that European level heat roadmap also helped mobilize a bit stakeholders around this. So I think, I always try to look at national and local action, so
yeah.
that we can
I
have
think you
scale.
need both, really. You need the national drive, and then you need to look at really at the local level, because at the end of the day, it's not by having a very big overarching framework that things are going to happen on the ground. You really need to then go down to the local level and see what is needed.
I think that reflects also on what Priya was saying in terms of the needing a vertical governance and integrating national and local action together. Dimitris, maybe I can turn to you on this question. And how have you experienced using different finance models to overcome the barriers in terms of, like, if there isn't a master plan in place, or if there isn't this sort of regulatory environment in place? Are there other steps that can be taken to enable private sector investment, for example, through the financing model you've mentioned?
Yes, absolutely. First, I definitely echo what Prima, yourself, and Andrea mentioned. I think all of the points are very, very relevant. And another area that, well, there are different pillars that can be activated. So, for instance, sometimes the insurance industry can be involved to ensure that certain gains are achieved by the sector. But then I also think, like, actually the financial sector should really take an active role in incentivizing the actors. So, for instance, one activity that I've seen is some financial institutions are connecting the interest in a debt to the performance of the contract. So, meaning that if certain reduction or improvement in energy efficiency are met, the interest rate on the debt is decreased. And so this really gives, from one side, the incentive really for the private sector to achieve the targets, whether it is, a customer buying a solution, reducing their consumption, or a solution provider implementing a solution, but also it closes the loop in the financial sector to measure really what is happening. Because what we've seen across industries is that very often money is deployed, but there is not a closed loop in measuring really what's the result of that investment. And I think they have a role to take in that part.
Thanks, Dimitris. That's really, really interesting. The idea of linking, for example, interest rates and debt to efficiency performance. So that's great. And
Lily, I think that this
yeah.
might be a good stopping point, actually, if that's okay.
Okay.
I
Sure.
know we've gone over a half an hour already, and I want to respect everyone's
problem.
time.
Of
I really
course, of course.
appreciate you all for taking the time, and I want to thank each of you for presenting on your solutions and speaking on this really important issue for our climate goals, and also for our building decarbonization goals. It's a critical piece in achieving decarbonization in the built environment. So it's something that we need to be thinking about. And as you've said, making sure that it's not siloed. So again, thank you everyone for joining, and we'll be sharing this online and of course posting it. So appreciate you for taking the time today. Thank you all.
Thank
Many
you.
thanks.
Thank you.